to begin by telling you about one of the strangest rebellions in history. We're going to do 3 weeks on looking at biblical rebellions, essentially to talk about how sin spread. And this is about as weird a story of rebellion as you'll find. So, Australian soldiers were deployed to combat a rebellion of, wait for it, emus. After World War I, farmers in Western Australia were struggling with emus, destroying all their crops. So the government, this is my favorite part, sent in the military with machine guns to deal with the emus. Despite their efforts, the emus proved to be too fast, too resilient, and the soldiers lost what has now been humorously dubbed the Great Emu War. You can look this up. There's newspaper articles about it. It's ridiculous. But it's a rebellion that's almost unbelievable. It's something that seems like it would belong in a cartoon, not world history. But sometimes that's what rebellions are. They're almost unbelievable. They're so strange that we can't quite explain how that came to be or why that happened, but it did. And that brings us to our text for this morning. The text we're going to look at this morning is without a doubt one of the most bizarre texts in the entire Bible. This is a passage that many pastors and many preachers avoid. They jump over, they try not to go here because it is tricky to preach on. It's been debated, what we're going to look at, by scholars and wrestled with by theologians for millennia. It's a crazy story, but it's an important part of the story and understanding how, again, sin spread and rebellion increased. But it is strange. If you want to follow in your own Bible, we're going to look at one key passage this morning, Genesis chapter 6. This is the beginning of the account of Noah. We're going to look at the first 9 verses of this chapter. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Married is a sanitized translation. It's a more of a union in a physical sense. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." Then jumping down to the next section, just the beginning in verse 9, this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. You probably didn't cover that story in Sunday school. You've probably seen stories like it in science fiction movies, Marvel movies, other superhero movies. Which is always interesting because these ideas come from somewhere. So let me give you some context here. And before I give you context, let me just say this, that it's easy in stories like this to get caught up in the unusual. And you go, oh, that's so weird. And so we think about all the weirdness in it. But this story is actually not really about the unusual. It's actually about something incredibly common. It's about rebellion. It's about sin. It's about going against God's will. And this is just ultimately an account of that and how evil begins to spread and permeate and take over the earth. but it's also talking about a rebellion in another realm, in the supernatural realm, intersecting with the human realm. And so last week, again, we looked at the story of Eden, where Satan, a supernatural being, tempts humans. But it's ultimately a human rebellion. It's ultimately Adam and Eve that fail and are cast from God's presence. And they're sent out and they're cursed with the hope of redemption one day. And evil begins to spread. And the next story you find after Adam and Eve is that one of their sons kills their other son. Cain kills Abel. And evil continues to spread on the earth. And then you come to Genesis 6 and this story, this next account of the spread of sin. And this time it's not just two people and one snake, so to speak, but it's supernatural beings, plural, many of them, doing something bizarre and perverted with human beings. And so humans and the supernatural all rebelling, all going against God. Adam and Eve get it started, but the supernatural fertilized the sin, literally. They fertilized the evil that was on the earth. So that's our first point, really, is just that sin becomes fertilized so that it can bloom and grow and reproduce. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So this group of mysterious creatures called the Nephilim. The text says that the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. And the offspring of this unholy union are what is called the Nephilim. They are the result, the offspring of fertilized sin. Sin coming together with sin. Now, the Nephilim are this twisted, perverted expression of God's design for family. Now, the idea of sons of God procreating with human women might sound really bizarre, and I totally get it. So let me give you the interpretations for how theologians understand this. So there's two interpretations for this verse. There's a fairly common one that's been more the classical interpretation for many, many years, like centuries. And then there's I don't want to call it like a more modern translation, but there is a newer translation that more people are beginning to adopt. So the original understanding of what this is, what's going on here, is that the sons of God were descendants of Adam and Eve's other son, Seth. And the daughters of men were descendants of Cain. And so you have evil, Cain, having children with the righteous line of Seth. And it's being perverted and it's being distorted and it's being destroyed. So that has been the classical interpretation. That's what, like, even somebody like Augustine, he would have taught that. But that doesn't really fit the language of the text. In the Old Testament, the term sons of God doesn't talk about sons of Seth. It talks about divine beings. Elsewhere, if we find this term, it's talking about angels in like Job 1:6. It's not talking about descendants of any human being. And so then there's this other interpretation, and this is the one that where I would hold, is that these sons of God are supernatural beings. They're part of the divine council that we talked about in week 1. And that they're spiritual beings created by the one true God, but who rebelled against him and came down and fathered children, offspring with human women. And then these divine beings, much like the original enemy in the garden, acted on their own wisdom and their own desire, trying to be like Yahweh. Either way, whatever interpretation you want to take, this is still a rebellion against God. It's still a destruction of what God intended. It's still a problem. It's still the spread of sin. So we ask, though, why would they do this? If we go with this more the newer interpretation, why would they do this? Why would these sons of God do this? So Michael Heiser, who's guided so much of this study for me and for you, explains it like this. He says the sons of God were trying to reformulate Eden. where the divine and the human coexisted in their own way. They presumed to know better than God what should be happening on earth, just like the original enemy had. Alteration of God's plan to restore his rule ends up making a bad situation worse. So the sons of God thought that they knew better in regard to what should be happening on earth. And this rebellion then becomes this driving force in the spread of evil. And here's why. At the end of verse 4, the Nephilim are described as mighty men and kings of renown. And this suggests that they held positions of power and influence, ruling over communities and kingdoms. And because they were this bizarre hybrid of supernatural, human, they probably operated with a unique wisdom, a unique stature. Other places will translate these characters as giants. And people listened to them and followed them. And so when they led people astray, they went happily along because this person was worth following and trusted and had presence, had authority, etc. But obviously, instead of leading people towards God, they're leading them and influencing them to walk away and to continue to rebel. And so these Nephilim are this hybrid race that opposes God's purpose. And yet they're revered by sinful humans. And evil begins to spread. So again, this is all pretty strange stuff. And I understand for our post-enlightenment, rational, scientific minds, sometimes it's hard for us to even want to believe this, and which is a great question. Do you believe what's in the Bible? Do you believe what's in the Bible, right? But a good, helpful tip, and I said this last week, to understanding things that are hard and how we interpret Scripture is to say, well, does the Bible talk about this elsewhere? Do other biblical writers mention this, talk about this? Did they have an idea of what was going on here? And they do. Not a ton, but they do talk about this. The story is referenced elsewhere in the New Testament, and I'll show you in a second. And it was also referenced by other writers that were very popular at the time of Jesus in particular. So Peter and Jude in the New Testament both refer to the angels who sinned before the flood. You can find that in 2 Peter or in Jude, verses 5 and 6. And they describe how these angels were punished and imprisoned under the earth until the final judgment. And some of what Peter and Jude say come from Jewish sources that were outside of the Bible, particularly a book called 1 Enoch. And this book, though not considered scripture, is well known to early Christians. And it gives us some context of what Peter and Jude saw going on. And it suggests that these sons of God either convinced people that they were trying to help humanity by sharing divine knowledge, or they were trying to create their own image bearers, to eliminate the image of God the Father and stamp their own image in his place. And so Peter and Jude certainly seem to think that there's these supernatural beings who are part of the spread of sin, responsible for, again, it increasing on the earth. But I think most importantly, what we see from these other biblical writers is that they took Genesis 6 seriously. They didn't just go, well, I don't really know what that means. Move on. This formed their worldview. This formed their theology. This formed their understanding of even Jesus Christ. They saw it as a key point in the explanation for evil and the problem of it. Now, as I've said, this is weird. It's new. I suspect. Let's just do this for fun. Show of hands. Anybody heard a sermon on the Nephilim in church before? That's me. Groundbreaking. You have to be at a church at least north of 7 years to preach on the Nephilim. You got to do a lot of investment in people's trust. You start here, you're probably not long for that post. So I'm going to show you a video from the Bible Project because it's going to concisely put this together. It's going to give you some visuals. Some of this will be just repetition of what I've already said, but it's probably worth hearing twice, all right? So you can go ahead and play that, Brian.
After the snake comes the rebellion of the sons of God in Genesis 6. We're told that they have sex with women who then give birth to violent warrior giants.
Oh, right. The Nephilim. These are probably the strangest characters in the whole Bible.
Well, strange from your point of view. But ancient readers knew exactly what was going on. The ancient kingdoms around Israel claimed to be founded and protected by giant warrior kings who were part human, part god, and filled with divine wisdom.
Ah, I see. So the biblical authors are saying, hey, those warrior kings, they shouldn't be honored.
Right. In this story, they're portrayed as human rebels who are captive to spiritual evil, spreading their violence in God's good world.
Yeah, and one of those kings in Genesis 10 goes on to build the city of Babylon.
Yes, Nimrod, whose name sounds like the Hebrew word for rebel. And his kingdom leads to the next rebellion, where humans exalt themselves in Babylon.
But God scatters that rebellion.
And when Moses in Deuteronomy looks back at that story, he says that's the moment when God handed over the nations to worship the rebel host of heaven, the gods of money, sex, and military power. Moses is the first one to call them demons, that is, lesser spiritual beings.
So demons are spiritual forces at work behind corrupt human power structures.
Yes, but in the Bible, they also work on the personal level, animating and exploiting humanity's greed and selfishness, as well as the weakness of our mortal bodies. In the Bible, spiritual evil is at work in anything that drags God's good creation back into chaos, darkness, and death.
So this is why when Jesus arrives on the scene, he said his primary enemy is not human.
Right. Jesus and his first followers viewed all the pain and suffering in God's good world as a sign of its captivity to death and spiritual evil.
But they didn't think this was the end of the story.
Right. Jesus knew that the only way out of this cosmic ruin is to overcome evil and death itself, even if it costs him everything.
So why am I showing you all this? It's because I want you to see that God's desire for a family was in shambles. It was completely broken. His creation in heaven and his creation on earth turned against him. It's like a cosmic prodigal son story. Everyone who God made for his glory and for his pleasure has turned against him. And it's bad. It's so bad that we read that God saw nothing good on the earth. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. This is a staggering statement. A staggering statement. In just a few chapters after creation, humanity has reached the point where every intention of the heart is corrupted by sin. There's no glimmer of hope in this verse. It's a bleak assessment of the human condition. This passage begins with, the Lord saw how great the wickedness. The Lord saw how great the wickedness. What a tragic comparison to what was written just a few chapters before, where we read that God saw his creation and said it was good. Verse 5 says that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. What this means is that not only were their actions sinful, but also the hearts, the very wills of the people, the center, the command center of the human being was constantly bent towards evil, because they are evil at the very core of their being. A gentleman named Derek Kidner, who's a Bible commentator, scholar, theologian, I don't have a slide for this, but he just says that a more emphatic statement of the wickedness of the human heart is hardly conceivable. That every inclination of the human heart was bent towards evil all the time. It's hard to understand someone being evil to their very core. Perhaps fruits and vegetables, sort of an adult veggie tale, can help us understand. If you've ever peeled vegetables or fruit, I haven't. Chantel does it for me. I'll cut my hands. You'll notice that sometimes there's bruises. And you go, oh, what am I going to do with this? And so you cut the bruise off and you go, I think the rest of it's fine, and you keep it. You eat it, you throw it in the pot, whatever you do with it. But then there's other times where you pick the thing up and it's rotted to the core. Even what's on the outside may not have given away what was on the inside, but it might stink, it might be old, it might be, severely discolored. And so you don't keep any of it. You just discard the whole thing. And in a poor sort of attempt at understanding what it might look like to be rotten to the core, where every inclination of the human heart is only bent towards evil all the time, it might be like this. Humans weren't just bruised with sin. They weren't just blemished with it. They were completely permeated, taken over by evil all the time, all the time. And so God sees nothing but evil. Now, to arrive at that state for humanity, man, that did require a very lengthy fall from grace. A lengthy fall from the garden where it was good in God's eyes. And God was delighted to walk in the presence of his people, to be with them. Rather than grieved at what he'd made, God was pleased with it, wanted to be with it. But now he's regretted that he's ever made people. The depth of humans' evil leads God to profound sorrow. Not because he made a mistake. God does not make mistakes. But because he deeply desired a family of people who would live in relationship with him, who would love him, who would respond to him, who with their own free will would say, "You are worth giving my life to and walking faithfully with." And they've turned, and it's a disaster. Now, there is a surprising message of good news in the midst of all this. There's a promise of God's radical commitment to his family, that he does not give up. He does not give up on this which he has desired most. And even though the strange rebellion of the Nephilim has fertilized sin on the earth and it's pushed humanity to these new depths of corruption, the story of this rebellion is still a story of grace. And God's redemption plan, amazingly, doesn't require an army equal to the sinners, so to speak. God only needs one. The Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. And he walked faithfully with God. This week, I heard another member of the clergy here in town talking about how they were preparing for a Bible study that they were leading. And they had just noticed how many reoccurring themes and threads there are in the book of Genesis. There's just this repetition to the book. And so I was listening with interest, as I've been in Genesis a lot for my sermon study, for our services. And so I listened, and I agreed. It does. It has tons of patterns that just repeat and repeat and repeat. And one of those is God speaking redemption while speaking judgment. The great tension of grace and judgment. God's holy wrath, but also this relentless mercy that just doesn't stop. So it happened after the rebellion in Eden. God speaks the curse, but he also speaks of redemption through the woman's offspring. And then it happens in Noah's day too. God determines to flood the earth as an act of judgment, but he also saw one man named Noah who was faithful. And during judgment, God determined to redeem through Noah. Genesis 6:8 says, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." You know who else found favor in the eyes of the Lord? Mary, the mother of Jesus. Same thing. He finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. And this verse in this passage, this story, this account, it's like a breath of air while drowning. It's like we're going deeper and deeper and deeper, and there's no life, and then suddenly it's just, Noah. There's Noah. It's a beacon of light in a dense fog when you don't know where you're going. And in a world consumed by wickedness, this one man stands out, and God saw him. Now, I want you to make sure that you notice that Noah's noticeable righteousness is not based on his own merit or his effort or his works. It's based on his faithfulness to God. It's based on his relationship with God. He's described as a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and most importantly, that he walked with God. In a world where Nephilim and their human followers are in rebellion against God, walking away from God, Noah's faithfulness to God sets him apart. That's what God responds to. And church, this is more than just a happy good news thread in the middle of an otherwise depressing narrative. Noah's noticeable life is a powerful example of the importance of responsibility with our individual free will. God gave his creation, he gave us free will, and the reason he gave us free will is because we could not bear his image if we didn't have it. We have to have free will. Furthermore, free will is the vehicle by which we say we love you, God, and we will walk with you. If we don't have free will and we are just robots and forced into it, we don't ultimately choose to love God. And God placed free will in every one of us that we would decide for ourselves to love him or not, to walk with him or not. But many use free will to rebel, to go their own way. But Noah used it for faithfulness. While the world around him is falling into chaos, Noah remains obedient to God. And it wasn't because it was so easy for him to do this. It wasn't because he didn't face any temptation or pressure. It wasn't because he was a member of the clergy, so he had more time to read his Bible. It wasn't because he didn't face stress at the office or that Noah didn't float through the world untouched by sinful realities. He was in it. He lived in it. He faced pressure every single day. And yet he stood firm against the rebellion. Noah somehow decided that he didn't want his life defined by being another person corrupted by the sinful creation that he was a part of. He wanted his life defined by commitment to God. And Noah, contrasted against the Nephilim, offers this important lesson that how we use free will matters. Even when the world seems hopelessly lost, choosing to walk with God in the thick of the hopelessness still matters. God doesn't respond, church, to you do you or my personal truth. God doesn't respond to that. God doesn't see that and go, oh, lovely. They're so wise. He says, I'm going to flood the earth for you do you. He responds to the one who says, no, I will walk faithfully with you. He sees faithfulness and he sees it with favor, but he looks at rebellion with regret. I mean, at the risk of oversimplification, like, how do you want God to look at you? With favor or regret? And also, don't miss that this decision of Noah's to walk faithfully with God mattered not just to God or even just to Noah, but it mattered to others. It mattered to the whole human race that would come after the fact. It mattered to his family, and it mattered to animals. It mattered to creation that Noah was faithful. God would use Noah to rebuild that which he desired most, his people and his creation, his earth. Derek Kidner, who I mentioned earlier, comments on God seeing the one during a rebellion like this. He says, God's characteristic way with evil is to meet it not with half measures, but with the simultaneous extremes of judgment and salvation. Simultaneous extremes of judgment and salvation. In the flood, we see both. God judges sin, but he also saves the faithful. I like that. I like that God used Noah as a means of extreme salvation, even in the midst of extreme judgment, simply because Noah walked faithfully with him. So here's the sermon in a sentence, and it's a long sentence. I've discovered that if you just put in enough commas, the whole sermon can be one sentence. When spiritual rebellion and evil had reached its peak, Noah's faithfulness and commitment to walk with God set him apart, demonstrating that even one righteous person can find favor with God and become a means of extreme redemption amidst severe judgment. So as we wrap this up, it's good to ask, why does this story matter today? And there's a couple reasons why it matters. The first one is because we're still called to be faithful in the midst of corruption. We're still called to be faithful in the midst of corruption. Just as Noah was called to walk faithfully in a broken world, we too, still today, are to remain steadfast in a world filled with temptation and corruption and chaos. Noah's faithfulness was not to be perfect, but it was about being committed. Being committed to God, even when it made him stand alone. And today, the same choice lies in front of us. Will we walk with God when culture, family, the educated professors at university, and our friends, and our career, and our ambition all pull us in another direction? Will we stay committed to God? This also matters because God's commitment endures today. Just like our faithfulness matters still today, so does his commitment. Sin continues on the earth. Yes, Jesus has won the victory, but there are still some enemies that he's rounding up. The kingdom is here, but it is not fully here just yet. And there's still sin, there's still rebellion against God's plan. Today, there's still opposition. And God's commitment to having this human family, his desire for relationship, that remains. It endures. And Noah reminds us that despite the darkest rebellion, God is constantly at work to restore and redeem. That he is divinely convinced of his desire for you and for me. That he stops at nothing. He's always creative. He's always working. And even more than Noah, we have Jesus, who Noah points us to ultimately. The greater Savior. The one who didn't just survive the waters of judgment, but he walked into death itself to rescue humanity from sin and rebellion. Noah was faithful in the face of judgment, to be sure, but Jesus goes even further. He's faithful to the point of death, where he takes the judgment upon himself. Noah didn't take it upon himself. He floated on top of it. Jesus actually went down. Noah was saved from the flood, but Jesus willingly bore the flood of God's wrath on our behalf. And so finally, the choice remains before us. As we reflect on this story, we are reminded that we too live in a world that feels far from God. Our homes, our families, our workplaces, our cities, our governments. But like Noah, each and every one of you, as am I, are invited to make decisions every day. Will we let the corruption cause our love for God to grow cold? Or will we stand firm? And that's not just a hypothetical possibility based on Noah's experience and me trying to use some clever wordplay. Jesus actually talked about this. In Matthew 24, verses 10 to 12, look at what Jesus says. At that time, he's talking about the end, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm will be saved. Many will turn away from the faith, betray and hate one another, and the love of many will grow cold. He's not talking about the people here that never believed. He's talking about people that did. And they went, oh, that's too hard, I give up. I can't walk with God anymore. But Jesus asks that we, like Noah, choose to walk faithfully with God despite the pressure, the temptations, the chaos, the disappointment, the unanswered questions, the doubts, the why me, the wounds, the hurts, our own failures, our own letdowns, our own hurts towards others. Will we even still walk committed to Jesus? Walk committed to God, not perfectly, but committed. Or will we turn? And of course, my prayer for every one of you and for myself is that we would see again how much God desires a family. That we would see that through Jesus, He's offering us still the opportunity to be a part of it, if we remain faithful. And so, church, as we leave today, there is no more important consideration for this moment than to consider your own walk. Are you walking faithfully with God? You will run out of time, as will I. Are you allowing Him to shape your choices and your relationships and your life's direction? And if not, then what is and why? The world may be chaotic and your family may be disordered and your internal life may be very, very anxious. It may not be the way you planned it. But keep the faith. Keep the faith. God's eyes are on the faithful. He sees the faithful. And He's ready to partner with those who, like Noah, stand firm, not through perfection, but through faithfulness.